Good day and welcome to today's webinar, Performance Engineering and Proven Practices. This webinar is brought to you by the Vivit Performance Engineering Special Interest Group, and we have 4 leaders in the group: Todd DeCapua, Petar Puskarich, Paul Shovlin, and Chris Trimper. And we have a little bit.ly short link if you want to jump to the Performance Engineering SIG site for Vivit. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Petar Puskarich and narrated by myself, Chris Trimper. Both of us are leads in the Performance Engineering SIG. Next slide. Petar is Steve Wozniak's long-lost cousin who shares the passion for performance in nearly everything in life. He has 20 years in the QA field, in which specifically 15 of those were surrounding performance engineering. He has experience across nearly all the standard HPE and OSS tooling and is currently on a mission to provide an organization incredible engineering and leadership ability. We're also joined by Brandon Tietz, the lead of performance engineering at Nationwide Insurance. He's responsible for deep dive expertise and root cause analysis, enterprise performance testing, Agile, and iteration manager. Strategy and technical road mapping and vendor management are also under his realm of expertise. Both Brandon and Petar were attendees at this year's 2016 Performance Engineering Summit. A little bit of housekeeping before we do begin. This is a live session and it is being recorded and is available to any and all Vivit members afterwards, and you should receive a link after the webinar if you want to go back and rewatch this later. Towards the end of the session, we will have a little bit of Q&A, and if you have any questions, just type them in the question pane. On this next slide, you're going to see the webinar control panel, and you can see in the bottom of that pane there's a question and chat. Any questions that you send in there, we're going to collect and go through towards the end of today's webinar. So let's get started. I'm going to pass it over to Petar to go over today's agenda and kick things off. Thanks, Petar.
Thank you, Chris. Well, as for today, we are basically going to cover a lot of different best practices in performance engineering in general. And as the summary that was published earlier mentions, looking at staffing tooling, visibility, organizational structures that we can propose, how the different process integrations with performance engineering into the different models of the testing life cycles, and some technical considerations. And while we were putting this presentation together, it became pretty obvious that the 3 top topics were going to kind of mesh into the bottom 3 since they all kind of cross each other. And then we'll be providing separate individual, small best practices as we go along with some of these topics. And to get going today, we're at our first part of the topic, which is under staffing and organizational structures. And Brandon, what would you like to start us off with today on this topic?
Sure, thank you, Petar. So as you guys can look at this, throughout all of our experiences, we've probably all experienced different kinds of organizational structures within the PE realm. Some have had good experiences, bad experiences. And over the last couple of years, as we've discussed with many other leaders, pioneers, and other people, we see different kinds of setups. And today we're just going to talk about 2 of them that I feel are heavily practiced, and then the third one, which is maybe more of a goal state or very few areas I've seen that have successfully gotten to play and kind of steps of how to get there. So the first one that I'm just going to cover is the distributed. So if you look at the first one, this is where we have multiple applications throughout the enterprise, and a performance engineer or a tester is actually distributed, dedicated to that team or on that Agile line, whatever it is. Sometimes you have a functional tester and a PE tester kind of be in the same role, but they are dedicated to that line. The centralized is more of a service-oriented type of team setup where here at Nationwide, that's how our PE team is we have a performance engineering team that is central, and we have applications that send us requests on a certain cadence. Most of the time it's a waterfall month-to-month release, and that's how the engagement begins, both with positives and negatives as we go through distributed and centralized that we'll discuss in a little bit. This third one, which I want to maybe spend just a little more time on, is the Center of Excellence, COE. I'm sure throughout the last couple of years, and maybe even so much more recently, Center of Excellence within the performance realm is something that's been kind of a hot topic and to figure out. So the proposal today is kind of give an idea of what maybe a Center of Excellence might look like, or some type of topics or conversations we can begin discussing with people. You'll notice the biggest difference between this last Center of Excellence and the first two is it's a life cycle. It's actually everyone talking to each other. You'll also notice that it doesn't specifically call out apps. It actually calls out more of phases. So within this, we have solution design. You roll into requirements, dev, functional, performance, deploy, and monitoring. The big key about this is no longer for the Center of Excellence, at least what I've seen is we want to see performance adopted within every single phase, not directly within an app. So solution design, they're performance-minded. And moves on to requirements. We are now looking at the user stories, the user acceptance criteria. Within development and functional, we're talking about CI, continuous integration, build. You move into performance testing and deploy. So whenever you have a test and then you get a sign-off and go okay to deployment, post-deploy, you have a pre and a post, and you can see what the difference is. And then lastly, which is a big one right now with a lot of the startups and some of the monitoring solutions, is monitoring and APM. So this is actually getting real live metrics, feeding that back into your test environments when you're workload modeling, capacity planning, and seeing how things go along. So the next couple slides that we'll get into, and I'll let Petar speak to this as well, we'll give some pros and cons. My style is I'll start off with the cons and go to the pros to end off on a good note. But that's kind of some of the things we'll be discussing today.
Excellent. And then looking across these three particular groupings, Brandon, do you see any, difference there with, how an organization grows from, say, bottom-up or top-down support that would, basically force a group into any of these configurations?
I think a lot of these are experienced. So when I actually look at maybe some understanding of where some groups stand today, I almost see this oftentimes grow from step 1, step 2, step 3 in a way. So yeah, I see a lot of organizations that have a performance tester, and oftentimes it's a tester that sits on the line. The engineering group is very different between every single company as far as what does engineering really mean. Some people, low test, they give metrics, and that's what they do, and maybe another group picks it up from that point and actually gives the root cause a deep dive analysis. So a lot of, I think it's just, what is it that you need in your organization and what are you ready for? So there are some areas that are great for centralized, there are some areas that are ready for that distributed, and there are some that are aspiring, like here at Nationwide, where we really want to get to that center of excellence. So I think from the bottom up, you kind of need that person that understands, okay, we need to really drive and make a message that performance is a critical deliverable, it is a real requirement, and that's where it comes from. If you don't have maybe a C-level or a top-down leader that sees that, sometimes it's just getting through the leadership. Sometimes it takes some outages, maybe before we've had the lessons learned in a retrospective. From top down, if you do have the fortune enough to have a chief of performance, a COP, or someone that's really focused on the performance realm that is maybe across data analytics, maybe big insights and data, virtualization, it just really depends on what your organization looks like. From this perspective, I see many performance testers and performance engineers that are begging to maybe see some change and feel like they are a requirement and a true deliverable, not just a green check mark maybe on the project timeline.
Excellent. Thank you. So let's get into this and dig into the next one, which is directly into distributed.
Yes. So, when we look at distributed, again, I'm going to start with the cons and the pros. And as we get through the different types of organizational structures, you're going to see maybe a little more bullet points because I've heard a lot more feedback in some of the other ones that are coming about. So let's talk about the cons. The first one is oftentimes you may be the only member on that line that knows effective performance engineering, or you're the only one that knows testing. When you're the only one in a group that knows a specific technical stack or technology, sometimes it's tough because you feel like you're on your own island, you don't have a lot of leverage, and it can cause some of those cultural barriers that you see when you provide some feedback. I've heard that you're constantly going between functional and performance testing, which sometimes becomes tough when you're doing different disciplines. I compare it to maybe back within school when you go from golfing to baseball. Yes, you're swinging, but you have a different format. It's a different approach. There are different things you have to think about. It's a different technique, and that's a kind of struggle I see with people. And then one of the last ones for the cons is the availability of work, depending on your project and release cycle. So let's say you're just a performance tester, or you're just doing functional, or you're actual in engineering. Sometimes the available work is slow, sometimes it's too much, and then you kind of get throttled, or you feel like there's a queue that's just waiting on you, and sometimes it becomes tough. Here are the pros of that, though. When you are a dedicated performance engineer, the good news is oftentimes you can become reserved, you're allocated to the project. So that's all you have to worry about. You know, you're dedicated to the line, to that project, and watching that work stream flow through. You're most likely to be embedded into the software delivery lifecycle of that team just because you sit with them, you work with them directly, and you might get considered in there, but it just depends on the culture that you currently live in. One of the other great things is if you live like on an Agile group or you have some poly-skilling going on, it's a great opportunity to learn some of the development, the testing phases, and actually start building that kind of cycled culture where you're not just tossing it over to a new phase and it's being bounced back with the defect or a bug and what's going on within that phase. And the last one is you can actually become a SME of the application, which is great because you'll learn the tribal knowledge, you'll be able to diagnose root cause analysis much better. You are, again, dedicated for that application, and you can maybe be more of a benefit to that organization because you have a performance mind within that code, within that team, and you can see kind of everything come together.
And then from this point of view, this is probably the first, say, evolutionary stage of a performance group. Would you agree with that, Brandon?
I would say so. I would say as Agile lines are being built, when you create an Agile team, depending on what your sprints are, I don't see an engineer instantly considered to be part of an Agile group. You know, you get your requirements team, you get your development team, and you get your testers. Often, you know, you can think about the three amigos, right? And they have each of their roles. Oftentimes, I don't see that functional testing, that user acceptance testing group embedded right away. So the distributed approach, you almost have an organization that dedicates an engineer to that line to help at least get things going right away.
Okay, excellent. So with that, we're going to go to that middle phase that a lot of companies are actually in, that centralized view, before they start getting into that center of excellence model, which we're striving, or at least a lot of groups are striving to get to.
Right. So here's that centralized. So this is where maybe outside of the distributed, you know, you actually are a team that sits together. So you're almost engaged maybe as a service. You know, here at Nationwide, that's the way that we are currently. We're right in the middle of all of our application teams and all of our lines of business. So there's pros and cons to that. So let's talk about the cons. You know, the first one is obviously project allocation or timelines. It's very difficult at times to be requested soon enough, at the right phase, have enough time to get what you need to. Within that, the demand, similar to distributed, but a little more extreme in my opinion in this case, because now instead of just being allocated to one project, you now are working with X amount of projects. I can tell you my team on a heavy month can crank out 100 different projects for 100 different applications depending on what's going on. So as we look at the demand, sometimes it's really heavy or sometimes maybe not so much. I can tell you, at least in our case, we are almost always on demand and always at full allocation. We are at the end of everyone's SDLC. So when you look at your framework across the enterprise and you see at what point is performance really being considered. And when you're centralized, sometimes you get engaged again too late. You're at the end. If you're an Agile team that is doing 1 week sprints and you're on a waterfall release model per month application release, that is 4 sprints of code that has been labeled and stacked on top of each other before you really are thinking about performance, and that can be a problem. The mindset transition. So in this situation, these centralized engineers are finding themselves, okay, how much do I have to get through rather than how well am I getting through that work? And that's a problem because we feel like even if we want to spend the time to root cause, you have all this pending work behind you that's knocking at your door and you're getting pressured to get it through as fast as you can rather than as well as you can. And the last one kind of goes into the previous one is working environment. It feels reactive rather than proactive. This is kind of is a part of that shift left movement that we'll get into a little bit later. But a lot of engineers that I talk to across the enterprise that are living or throughout the industry that are living decentralized, they feel very reactive. They don't feel like they're comfortable enough getting ahead of it. They have the confidence, they have the support. It's almost like things are almost simmering, they're almost on fire by the time they get to them because you're being so pressured to get this done, and sometimes it's only for a check mark rather than an actual valuable deliverable. For the pros,
that's best practice.
Yeah.
And that
yeah.
we tried to, I guess, work against for several decades actually in the field. And then I wanted to also add in while we're in this particular model, when you're saying that the pressure and the I guess that lack of time to do the deep dives properly and adding that quality. is this particular model also supportive of having specific roles for those deep dive analysis, whether they're specialty engineers or whatnot, that are still part of the centralized group for the performance engineering team, but yet they're not really doing the day-to-day testing?
Right, and that's a very good point. And for a while, that's kind of how we were set up. We were centralized, and we had these deep dive engineer roles, which was great because if you had a production outage, you needed someone to get on a phone call or get into the war room and figure things out. That was great. But what we started realizing is people that wanted opportunities to be a deep dive engineer, we basically said, is there a reason why not everyone in the group can become a deep dive engineer? All of us learn things in different experiences, different situations. I feel I've learned the most from performance engineering when something wasn't working, when something breaks. Or when something breaks. When something breaks, that means you have to figure something out. And the more times you get in a situation to actually do it on hand, it really makes it easier for you to adjust. So with the con, we've actually taken away that deep dive engineer role, and now everyone's expected to be able to jump into a production situation.
Excellent.
Now, those are the cons, right? And let's end on a positive note. So let's look at the pros. The pros are this. Obviously, as a PE group, as a PE team, you're grouped together and you're allocated per request. So in the first one we talked about poor project allocation. The good news is, since we're a group, you can talk about, okay, who's available, who's not. How do we figure out what and how and when do we actually get into these requests as a team? One of the latest things that we're really noticing and getting heavy on are the peer reviews. So not only is it good enough just to have an engineer go through the requirements and take it through the whole life cycle, we want another set of eyes, just like in development, pair programming. We're calling this cross-engineering, pair engineering. Having people sit together, a driver or passenger, to look at a same set of results, the same set of problems doesn't hurt, because you might have a different approach. Some people are more tool-based. Some people are more, let's get down into the logs and look at those IAS requests, come right all through and see what's going on. Team observation, support available to that individual PE. So everyone's at, a different experience as to true performance engineering. For example, I came from a development background. We have some people that actually came from chemistry, some that came straight from actually project management, and they started learning the IT as they moved along. So being able to kind of hold each other accountable, test each other, lift each other up, and really push that PE skill set. The last one was just that service model again with the centralized, which will kind of take us into this whole center of excellence. So as we look at the center of excellence here, the COE, there's a lot here, and I'll try and flow through them as quickly as I can while not leaving too much out here. So, okay, let's look at the con. So the first con, it's not heavily practiced. It's a lot of learning curves, a lot of initial pains, just because it's a new transition. A lot of this is being driven by the DevOps, some of the lean practices, extreme programming, and it's not something that's being heavily practiced throughout the industry, and we're exploring that. The cultural concerns. So you've got to centralize. That's great. You're starting to get the PE name out there. You're starting to get people a good feeling. Now you're saying, okay, now excellence, what does that exactly mean? So it's new for them. You have your enterprise constraints and support technology. So does your technology support the COE? Is it ready to adopt it? Because some of it is heavy tooling. Can it support this transition? This is the biggest one, I think, of center of excellence. You need to have passionate engineers that are willing to step out of just doing straight load testing, just creating scripts, putting tests together, giving some numbers, and that's it. You really need people that are ready to step up, become PE practitioners, and be readily available for the enterprise root cause analysis. This is a big action item for me. When I talk to Todd DiCaprio, Patar, and some other people, we're looking for that PE readiness model. So being able to evaluate any application area, where are you at with development, what's your SDLC look like, and where does PE fit with you guys? One of the things that we want to do as well is actually hand some of the performance things back to the application team and show there's value in doing so. And the last con that we see that's being kind of a troublesome is, C-level leaders, as far as, are they being briefed on the importance of performance instead of being briefed that there's an outage? That's too late. We need to get some performance-embedded thoughts right from the get-go and track that ROI as we make these changes. Now, the pros, again, a lot here, so I'll try and flow through them rather quickly. Here's a pro of this. Performance finally has an enterprise presence and can be consumed as a framework. So again, we talk about development, monitoring, deploy, build. It's now as a forefront thought for each of these teams, because whether or not they realize it or not, it hits them at home because you will be impacted by that. Kind of the things that we've been saying over here, and I talk to other people, we really want to see some of the PEs in this excellence model kind of turn into practitioners, evangelists, kind of similar to how the Agile Scrum Masters are for Agile practices. You need to be a practitioner, because if you think about it, you're actually transitioning organizations or teams into performance. It's not just the deep dive and the technical, it's that soft skill communication that we're trying to figure out and how to get in line with. You look at the dev lines, if you're practicing this properly, you have your KPIs, your key performance indicators, your SLAs, you have that criteria coming through, and it's looking very good with end user experience always in mind. A term that I haven't heard anyone say outside of our team, I have an engineer on our team that kind of came up with this, and I love it. It's called performance ambassadors, and what we're kind of trying to think of, it's not really a specific role, it's more of a trait of someone we're looking on each line, someone who for sure always keeps that performance motivation going, just like Agile lines. If you don't have that one person that wants to keep living the Agile or in the Waterfall line to keep processes moving, it kind of is easy to let things fall and simmer, and they don't really continue on. So we're looking for performance ambassadors that can keep speaking to performance. Again, I'll drop a buzzword, DevOps. So as we look at the Center of Excellence, what we're seeing is this is a very good opportunity to embed into some of the DevOps movements. As you have your development and operations come together, continuous integration and build is becoming very popular. We're able to hand back certain key pieces of performance testing sooner in the life cycle, and we can actually be engaged for more critical observations and needs. This supports that shift left movement. So earlier I talked about the 1 month release with 4 Agile sprints. So if you're a dev team and you have 4 sprints of development before a performance engineer or a tester even gets a chance to test that code, that's a problem, because you might have been able to identify a module right at its very core and component as soon as it was developed. Right now, we're hoarding some of those performance testing practices just because that's what we're being told to do, rather than just giving it back to the developers, because a lot of development roles are turning very hybrid, and we should allow some of that to happen. As an aspiration component of the Pro, this opens up the opportunity for some of the large industry kind of new wave of technology. So you talk about operations, so IT process automation. This is your orchestration. You have your new networking technologies that are self-throttling, self-healing, self-managing. The modern web of mobile responsive design, your single-page apps, your single-page apps. And then you have, again, your continuous delivery, your CI, your CB, build and integration. And lastly, which is kind of a big deal for us right now personally, is that monitoring, that APM, all of this to kind of create that performance ecosystem that everyone's contributing to performance together as an enterprise, where you have the Center of Excellence to help keep best practice and standardization throughout.
Thank you. And then what I kind of want to add on to this part of it, too, as far as best practices, when you're in that Center of Excellence model, that also helps you get support for your engineering team, since this is finally where, even though it's listed as a con, so that not many of those C-level leaders are actually fully supported, but at least in this level, they're aware of, and performance is actually usually a target at this level, which then gives you that ability to have these pro sides. And that performance ecosystem is huge. One of the, I guess, the takeaways from my last year about being out here in Silicon Valley, playing around in different performance spaces, is that there are some really neat toolings and, I guess, methodologies coming about very shortly, especially along the lines in that monitoring APM space, and looking at production level data coming back to you in real time with some machine learning and even some AI added onto it, in order to basically help auto-categorize a type of real-time outage, or what's the impact of the systems, all for you. A lot of these systems are also looking at anomaly detection abilities now in different forms. So you can start looking at rumblings in that live data even before an outage is about to happen, whether it's going to be an hour, it would happen, or within the next 30 minutes. But at least you can start seeing these changes. And the performance testing world, that's also important, because then you can start going back into those development cycles and talk to the developers and say, hey, we see this in this performance test. Not only can we identify that this is something that's happening, but here is the precursor to it, and oh, what's going on in this part of the app. And
exactly, perfect.
Let's go into our first poll question. And Chris, if you would read that for us.
Thanks, guys. So our first poll today is, how is performance engineering structured within your organization? So please choose one of these options. Are you distributed, centralized? Do you have a center of excellence? Is it something else? Or are you still scratching your head trying to figure out what it is that we got? So give about a moment to get some results in and see where we're at.
And as a best practice, I'd say the three particular groupings that we talked about, at least over the last, let's say, 10 years or so, are pretty much those first three: distributed, centralized, and center of excellence. And one thing we can maybe look at in a future topic at some point is, how many times has your organization cycled between all three?
I agree. That'd be a very good one, too.
While we're waiting for some results, I can say personally, we are centralized and decentralized all at the same time, depending on our projects. All right, so let's look at how things are coming in. We got about a good majority of the folks voted, so let's close it up. So our results, we have 27% that said they are distributed, 55%, the majority that say they are centralized, 14% with a COE, no other practices, they tried to fit in those three, and just 5% that are still trying to figure it out. So Brandon, based on what you were saying, that the COE is the least used, that did come true in this poll. So let's hear what you got to say about some of these results, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd say it pretty much aligns up with what I've seen over my career. And yeah, with striving for that center of excellence, it's hard getting that consensus across an entire enterprise or organization versus the people that just matter down in that testing area. What do you think on that, Brandon?
No, I think you're exactly right. The thing that I purposely put in that last one, wish I knew, still trying to figure that out, because when I talk to some people throughout the industry, it's really true. They're not quite exactly for sure what is going on or where things are going. So for those 5%, I would be very interested if those that actually said that. I would love to kind of hear your thoughts as far as, you know, what's the confusion, what's going on with that, and see if there's something maybe we can work out, because there might be a different model that we're not even aware of. So we want to make sure we have that captured too.
And if you are one of those individuals that selected that, please submit a question in the question box, and we'll take a look. We're always trying to discover new things as well. All right. With that, let's move into our next area, looking at what are these best practices for the different types of the process integrations for performance engineering into these particular three. So Brandon, what do you have for us today on Waterfall, Agile, and Hybrid?
Yeah, so no problem. So as we look, obviously all of us have heard of Waterfall and Agile, and then kind of the hybrid models. So if we go to the next slide, in order to kind of get into specifically, this is an example of like a life cycle. I'm not going to spend too much time because all of us have seen countless life cycles, all in different interpretations. This life cycle, I'm actually giving some insight into at a very high level how our group is working actually here at Nationwide, as far as kind of things that we look at. So, you know, some of the things I'll just clear up real quick is SPOC, that's single point of contact. So who is our actual contact? You have your workloads, your tests, the milestones, and you move into your scripting phase. We all know of these. Test prep, you have your applications under test, that workload, getting those tests created and modeled, and then you move into the testing analysis where you execute, analyze, you do tuning, some trending, which is a little more advanced, but we're getting into it more and more as well, the root cause reporting, and sign-off and retrospective. The biggest thing that you might see throughout the rest of the slides is that in the middle, it's the consumability of work. So as a service-oriented group that gets requested for us, work and requests that come into us that are consumable are huge, any for our downstream or children teams that we rely on so heavily. So we call it our cow, C-O-W. We actually drew a picture of a cow, and we drew some things that go on with the cow. We made it a little bit of fun to see how we can make it adoptable in practice. So this consumability of work is huge for us. So if we roll into Waterfall here, One of the first ones, again, you'll see another mini Lifecycle. Waterfall, not too much here because we all kind of work in it, but when your performance team is a Waterfall team, so again, you're engaged in a side per project, per team. This is often kind of goes into you're dedicated into that organization, or what I've talked to and seen. You're kind of aligned into that dedicated model, or maybe what Chris talked about, sometimes you're centralized or you're decentralized depending on how that works. You remain the single point of contact for that team. You don't have to worry about context switching, which is really, really great when you're in that model. You have a designated backup for project handoff situations. So one of the issues that we're still working through is when you have a group of people together, who is actually going to take that work that you've been dedicated to. So in the waterfall model, if you're polyskilling and you're working with other people, sometimes it's easier to hand that off because you live in the team and you know all the contextual and kind of silent things that are going on. You get to be more exposed to be maybe more of a leader or a PM experience per application in this waterfall model, because it allows you to take a project all the way through the life cycle, see end-to-end what is going on, and have a good retrospective afterwards. And the last one is you become a valuable SME and tribal knowledge of the application. You get to see the application flow through the whole life cycle. You kind of get a feel to get to see the in and outs and how things are going along with that. I didn't include cons because we kind of talked about the cons or the other ones. That's kind of what we look at when your team is a waterfall team, you're dedicated, you get to see a project through the whole life cycle and some of the benefits of doing so.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brandon, on that. I would say, adding on to this, that probably, I think waterfall was probably still one of the, it's still probably the most used model still, as even though other groups are moving into Agile and are in Agile. And I think it's the most standard one that's been in the industry for the inception of basically we've all been doing the testing processes. Where as a best practice, I'm coming around to the realization that yes, there are better ways to actually add the performance engineering role into Agile, and we'll be covering that next. But yeah, so Brandon, I had a question for you on this, as far as say waterfall and the shift left movement. Is it possible to do in waterfall?
You know what? That's a very good question. I think it is, but the issue is I think it depends on what your application teams are doing, right? So, if you still have application teams that are very waterfall model and they have 6-month, 8-month projects, if you get involved in solution design and you start talking about architecturally how the capacity plan and you start building out some solutions together, I think it's very possible to get in there early on, have that input as you see it. The problem becomes if you get pulled into the middle of it. So you're already in development, things are already so long, without the 1-week sprints or a couple-week sprints of Agile development to show it to your customer, the goods and bads. Sometimes it's difficult to find yourself to fit into it. So yes, it's possible. It's interesting to see everyone's different experiences, and actually this would be one I would love to hear from people to see what ways they also kind of let this slide into earlier in the life cycle. Excellent, thank you. And with that, we'll move into the next area that everyone is trying to get to. Yes. So Agile. So Agile, kind of like my bread and butter. There's definitely pros and cons to everything that we talk about with Waterfall, Agile, Hybrid, Vortex, whatever your team looks like. The team that hits, the type of style that hits home for us is Agile. You look at the top right, and I'll get into a little bit more later, is it's either blocked or it's consumable. And that's the two big things. Oftentimes, before you find yourself in many different places as far as where your work is and how you go about it, for at least our team and when we talk to other people, we're trying to set stone is we can either work on it or we can't, and we have a follow-up date of when we can consume it. So let's go into, just real quick, I'm sure most have heard Agile, but you have your backlog, you have your iteration plus 1, 2, 3 weeks. It looks like what work is coming, what does it look like, and you have your current iteration. We talk about, if it's blocked, and we don't have a follow-up date on when this work will be available or consumable, we roll into what we actually created as a cancellation process, which I know initially it kind of sounds maybe bold, but we'll maybe get into a little bit more. The purpose of it is to avoid that PE retainer. So when you get pulled into a project, since you're an outside resource, oftentimes you find yourself, okay, what am I doing? What am I supposed to be doing right now? And then they come back out of nowhere and say, okay, we're ready, you have 2 days. And that's kind of the thing we're trying to avoid. Within the Agile, we do have performance engineers that as an Agile group are available to pick up and reach out to the customer, not assign. So oftentimes the biggest change we've seen within an organization is when we say, okay, a performance engineer will reach out to you, their first response almost every time is, okay, who is it? Who is it? Who's my engineer? And we're like, well, we don't know yet because the engineer hasn't picked it up. And that's kind of tough for project planning, I think, to figure out who it is. But it's just to kind of make people available to make sure that no one is stuck on retainer, make sure no one is truly dogged down on work and it can actually do it. The consumable work is then prioritized and placed in the appropriate iteration columns to be picked up by a performance engineer. So it gets prioritized. We figure out who's available. How do we prioritize it is different throughout all organizations. Some are just delivery date strictly. Some have other high-level project priorities that can come down. Within an Agile team, we are practicing, and other teams I've talked to, you are tracking team throughput, which is your velocity. So you do velocity-driven commitments. You have your weekly cadence meetings, talk about your estimations, your iteration planning, retrospective, which is where you talk about how your week went as a team. You talk about the goods and the bads, and you can maintain 1-week sprints or 2-week or a month, whatever your sprint is. Our team does weekly sprints because it allows us to be a little more quick and adjustable to our applications as they have blockers, they have issues, or whatever else comes up. The biggest piece of this is when the work is blocked, we are big on follow-up dates as assigned and new consumable work is pulled into iteration. So if a blocker happens with a project, we don't accept sometime next week it will be available. We need an actual date. And it's not that we're expecting it to be done by that date. We just need to know when we need to reach out to you again. That way we're not kind of sitting here twirling our thumbs, understanding that when we can be available and to take that and that new work. And lastly, on the very right, maybe some have heard the saying, fail fast, fail often. Our group is the same way when I talk to others that are maturing in Agile space as a PE team. That's the goal is if you're trying to implement something, try it right away. If it doesn't work, fail it and try something new. That's the beautiful thing I do like about Agile. I know there's many cons. We can spend a whole presentation on the cons, but that is a good benefit piece, at least from my perspective.
Cool, thank you. And the one big thing I wanted to add on to this specifically that I really liked, all this basically happened after I left Nationwide about 1.5 years ago, and which is when we talk about the PEs based on the availability to pick up the work. So you don't have the engineer that's assigned to the team anymore. But as a best practice, what that actually starts, I guess, pushing in across the group is the fact that you no longer have, say, the superstar for claims or for commercial or, so whatever your application area is. And then you get the effect of, oh, you're giving us your A player or your B player. And you end up getting engineers that are all moving upward at the same time, which is what you want across your staffing.
Exactly.
And we'll go into the next one, which is this wild mix of it, which I know are doing.
Yeah, so to everyone's eyes, I do apologize. It was a late night. My daughter was awake, and I did the best that I could to try and GUI and put this together. So I will try and go through this as clearly as possible. But this is actually a visual of how our team actually works through when we're an Agile performance engineering team, but we serve a Waterfall monthly enterprise. So people go almost every single monthly release, the first Friday or whatever it is, and sometimes you have multi-sprints, you have one sprint, whatever is going on. And we are a service-oriented, centralized transitioning to that COE we're practicing. So I'll go through it really quickly and kind of give you a feel. So the request comes in. These red lines or these red rectangles are, compared to a solution diagram, oftentimes this means a firewall. This is our entry gate or a PE firewall, if you will. So this is what the request comes in, and we get some initial information and figure out what we can do. Once that request comes in, it moves to our backlog, and we actually meet with application teams 6 weeks out from when they actually need analysis in their inbox for a sign-off decision. We start 6 weeks out because, as you all know, blockers, happy paths don't happen, issues arise, so we need to get in soon enough to at least begin having some discussion. As we get a little bit closer to our current iteration, we actually have more solidified pieces. So each of those rectangles represents a piece of work that we can pull into our iteration and actually work on. And now we have our current iteration. Now, obviously, our team is not doing just 3 pieces of work. If anyone's listening from our team, they're probably laughing right now because that is nowhere near the case. But for the purpose of this, let's say we have 3 pieces of work that gets consumed. You have your performance engineers right there, and that cow, that consumability of work. If we can consume it, we start going through the life cycle, your requirements, scripting, tests, prep and testing analysis. If all goes good and miraculously you're able to get through all of your main performance engineering phases in a timely fashion, it goes to the application team, and then you have your sign-off, and you're great to go, no problem, no issues. However, in our experience, more often than not, there's blockers that arise. And prior to us implementing this kind of mini cancellation blocker process, we were always on retainer. We didn't have time to figure out where we at. If you had a handoff, you kind of got thrown into a fire. It was a bunch of issues. So the thing we kind of developed is, okay, how can we set up a healthy blocking process? So at the top it says no date equals blocked email. That's a big part of this. So if we have a blocker, we normally give the application team or whoever our customer is about a day. We'll give you a day to resolve your blocker. If we don't hear anything and we don't have a follow-up date to reach out to you, you then go through this small cancellation process. The first one is on that day, we send a blocked email. We'll say, hey, we're blocked. This is why we're blocked, and this is when we like you to try and resolve your blocker by, because a lot of this affects your timelines. If you're blocked for 3 weeks and you're expected to be done on the 4th week, obviously you're not going to be able to get it done. So it's kind of being honest, letting them know, hey, I need this from you. By the way, you're entering our cancellation process. Normally, as we look at our numbers, most people respond to us instantly because it's a healthy, friendly reminder. An engineer on the team once gave kind of like a DMV or BMV example. When you go into one of those, you go in for a registration or whatever is happening, if you don't have what you need, oftentimes if it's a big line, they don't sit there and let you figure out what to do. You go to the back of the line. You figure out, because next time you'll become prepared or you'll be ready to give what you need. So that's kind of how we kind of handle it in a much more healthy way. But we go through a current day. We'll wait 24 hours, 48 hours. If we still have not heard anything within 2 days, at least 2 days, the engagement is canceled, and then we actually send an application, a notification to them explaining why and what to do. Most of the time, people are happy about that because they know what went wrong, what they can do better next time, and how to maybe avoid it in the future, and they're always welcome to come back in through a new request. The opposite is, let's say at any point in this cancellation life cycle or this step model, they can come back. It goes back to the application team. It goes back to the performance engineer, and it is now consumable again. So if you got blocked in the requirements phase, congratulations, you can move back through scripting, you can go through testing, and everyone's in sync. It's, again, to avoid that retainment, avoid what am I doing, where am I at, and it keeps a clear playing field for everyone. But one of the last pieces of this that I didn't really describe, as Patari talked about it a little bit, it's kind of allow each engineer to kind of lead their effort, feel like they're empowered to baseline with other engineers, figure out how we can be better as a group. We're not saying no to people. We're just saying this is what we need because we care about your product as much as you, but we need to keep your timeline and our timelines in sync as well. So,
very good description. And at least from my experience across the multiple years, this is probably the first model I've actually seen that actually works. When you're talking about blending Waterfall and Agile and having a performance engineering team within any of the 3 different types we discussed, those models. So yeah, this is, I'd say, it's one of the takeaways for this group. This is a really strong, powerful message to take. With that, I believe we have our next survey. And yeah, poll question number 2.
All right. So for our second poll question, I'd like to know what methodology best describes your current team of PEs or your individual group or PEs stacked for performance engineering. Are you Waterfall, Agile, hybrid, possibly, or not currently sure? Let's give a moment for results to come in. While we wait, a comment to Brandon. I quite like your notification process. It's pretty cool. I may have to consider adopting that.
When our group looked at, when we went through all of our changes, we asked, I think it was in June, it might have been early June, we said, okay, of all the changes we've done as a team that's Agile, what's been your favorite? And everyone unanimously said that cancellation, that blocking process, because, again, it's not meant to be bold. It's meant as a friendly reminder that, hey, you need something from us, and we can't deliver it to you. Can you please get to whatever you need to do in a healthy way? And it allowed them to kind of learn about us, we learned about them, and we kept things moving. The beautiful part is we either got what we needed and we can continue, or the project was no longer deemed necessary, and that freed up an engineer's time.
Right, totally.
Fantastic. Well, it does look like we have the majority of the folks voting, so let's close the poll so we can take a look at the results. All right, so the results are in, and at the top at 48% is hybrid. Following hybrid is 30% for Waterfall, and then just after Waterfall is 22% Agile, and no others and no ideas in there either. So again, 48% hybrid, up next 30% Waterfall, and then following that 22% Agile.
Cool. So it sounds like most everybody is in the process and following some of these already. So already along in the best practices.
Yep, exactly. That's great to see. I really like seeing that kind of stuff.
Good deal. We're getting kind of pushed on time here just a tad, so we're going to move on to the next one unless, Chris, do you have anything to add on this?
I do not. Let's continue on. Thank you.
Cool. So now we're going to take a look at several technical considerations as they cross all of these. Brandon, if you want to kick this off, and I'll move into the first set of tool slides.
Perfect, and these ones shouldn't take too long. So, let's roll into the tool slide here. So this one was just kind of, when I talk to many different people, there's so many tools out here. So kind of what we did is we kind of just took a look across the industry. This may not include everything, and for the record, they are not prioritized in any best to worst. This just as we found them, we kind of put them together, and this is what we see. So the tools and visibility. So most of these are probably, I'm sure all of us have heard or I've used in some way or another. The focus of this slide was more, the tools and visibility piece, specifically visibility. So at the bottom, high level, and Pitar will definitely jump in here, as you know, when you choose a tool and you're figuring out what is it that we need, there's so many tools, all different things. How do we go about it? The first thing you need to figure out is you need to evaluate your enterprise technologies. What do you guys support? Are you a heavy step shop? Do you do much of mobile? Are you still legacy? What is it that's going on that you need to support? Once you kind of evaluate what your enterprise stands at, what will give you the best opportunity to be quick and a good time to market as you develop it? So again, that goes into evaluating what tool best sets you up for success. That success criteria is something definitely we could spend a lot of time on and figuring out as well. So that might be good. If anyone wants to reach out, please. I'm always interested to hear kind of what you value as time to market. And that also kind of contributes to business value and ROI. So within each of these suites, there's different analysis, there's different reports, there's different approaches. Do you have dedicated LGs? What is it that's a true business value to your company from a performance perspective, and what way can you track that ROI of performance? And that's one of the toughest things today is figuring out, I'm performance testing, I'm doing engineering, but since it's distributed and it's not always legacy where you can count MIPS or CPU tied to mainframe costs, it's not always as easy to find that real ROI of adopting distributed practices for performance engineering. So, that's kind of one of the things I look at is you look at these tools, think about some of these things as you go through it and see where you can find the most information.
Exactly. Thank you. And one of the pieces I really, one of my, soapboxes is visibility across the different enterprise tiers or even application spaces when you're looking at smaller app areas. Over the years, I've been a huge proponent for the HP Diag product, just for the fact that it can provide, the visibility internal to an application space, whether it's Java or .NET or now Python is even included. And several tools can do this. App Dynamics is another one that's also popular that's not listed on this particular screen. But between using some of those kind of toolings where you not only get what's happening at, say, your host level, your guest level, your hypervisor levels, you can actually start seeing inside the classes being called, down to the actual methods. And then it also gets back into, the maturity engineering-wise of the engineers in the particular group, too, of what you can drive out of some of these tools. A lot of, it's always great to have the tool available, but if you can't use it, it's helping no one. And that's one of the great things, I'd say about some of the newer APM tooling that's available, to where the concept of going to the single pane of glass is very, very helpful, to where you start at the top of an application suite, and then you double-click down into a business transaction, and then drive that down into the classes involved, down to and then to the method stack, the actual call trees. Then you can start saying, you can actually literally see highlighted for you all automatically in a lot of these cases, hey, it's 45% of your time for this one business transaction process took place in this one call to a database. Oh, and then you can start linking off into, oh, it's a database tier. Oh, the database tier looks fine. Let's drill into why that was. Oh, it looks like maybe you have an issue with back-end storage on that database. And you can, quickly, in some cases, go down rabbit holes. But in many cases, the guided direction of a lot of the current software really pinpoints where those issues lie for your system. Whether you're looking at HP Performance Center or even the newer the Storm Runner Load, the graphing ability in those tools are phenomenal now for the engineer to watch during load tests. And as a best practice, what I've developed over the years is, personally for me as a best practice, I would rather be a participant in the load test and actually watch it while it's under load or under whatever the design stress and workload is that you're subjecting it to, versus looking at the data after the fact. Because a lot of times in these toolings, the live data is, let's say, in a time bucket that is relevant to what's going on. So you're looking at the live 5-minute buckets in a lot of these cases, and you can drill down into plus or minus 3 seconds in many of these tools. That gives you that ability to say, hey, this is an outlier, and it's true, it's there, it happened, versus you see an average blip in a graph later on, and you have to wonder, well, was that actually important or not? And that's one of the things that I've kind of developed over my career as a kind of like my specialty is of doing the deep dives, whether it's in production or in the PT environment. But having an SME on your performance engineering team, or at least, like in a lot of these cases now, at least a pair of engineers now that can learn this, is often extremely helpful. And Brandon, have you seen anything with that case at Nationwide as you're bringing up some of these deep dive experts?
Yeah, I'd say so, and especially for the visibility piece, that's one of the biggest things. You talked about a lot of APM tools. We're trying to actually find out what integrations we can do with these teams, because once you instrument a lot of these tools and you actually have the exact packages and the installs and you have everything kind of talking together and working as kind of that performance ecosystem, I think it's great for the deep dive analysis and allowing the engineer to be more quick. And also, if you think about it, not just the engineers can look at that information. It's actually great polyskilling opportunities for others to take a look, figure out what's going on, and learn themselves. That way they can resolve it sooner. As they are developers, they can actually make the changes. And now they actually have a quick retrospective from a code standpoint that this is what went wrong and this is how maybe we can avoid it happening in the future.
Excellent. Okay, and with that, let's move on to that next little piece. So we have hybrid infrastructure, we have the visibility and tools, and now where does this stuff live?
Yeah, so we only have a little bit left, so I'll do this really quickly. So basically the purpose of this slide was, when I talked to a lot of people, the issue that happens is from a load perspective, they want the SaaS solutions. They want SaaS, but the problem is, either through security or a firewall or networking or bandwidth consumption, data centers and all that, whatever it is, they're not able to get into the internal facing applications, your TRUs. So that's where oftentimes we have on-prem load generators that are handling that. So you have your LGs, you have your application under test, you have your private internet application, and the load's happening. Or on the other side, you have your TUR internet-facing LGs, your .coms, that are facing your customers often, and that's where you're able to have the cloud load generators able to, conduct the load, disperse it, and hit those applications. This hybrid infrastructure is beneficial to have because oftentimes in many organizations you have that artificial performance impact due to you have all this routing that comes into play with monitoring, pipe routing, load balancing. So when that virtual user comes through, it actually has this skewing of results that's happening. That's no good. You don't want to report on bad results just due to the way the organization's handling it. It's an easier cultural adjustment to have it on-prem, so you're able to get people more comfortable with what you're doing, but you're also losing that geographic testing capability. The infrastructure cost, so if you take the on-prem and you move it to off-prem, at least for churn and trust, you can potentially cut your infrastructure costs down 50% because now you don't need as much capacity to support the load testing. Under cloud, you know, with some of these vendors, they're giving you the latest, greatest for your tenant. So when you agree to meet with a CSM or some type of manager that you want the latest and greatest as they release it, you automatically get upgraded. You don't have to have an administrator update your infrastructure, get to the latest and greatest. Because you all know as you move through schemas and other issues with installs, sometimes it becomes time-consuming. You hold the vendor accountable for your cloud and SLAs. So you have your SLOs, your Rs and As, all the different kinds of upgrades and support for the cloud. And then one of the ones that I really like with the cloud solution and having this on-prem is you're more likely to get integration invitations because it's the latest and greatest, so you get to be a part of betas, design, industry leaders. You can integrate to some APM solutions. So some people like to have a hybrid infrastructure because of certain things that prevents them from going full cloud, but there's benefits to having them both at least available to give you what you need, especially that geographic testing. If you're on-prem, you have to go that network virtualization approach, but geographic testing is definitely a good one because you have multiple data centers that can produce the load.
And this is specifically around the actual testing infrastructure versus where you're actually hosting your applications, correct?
Correct, yes. This is about, you know, where your load generators are actually located or how the load is being created from the solution.
Are there any best practices, I guess, or concerns around having, say, those cloud-hosted load injectors just out there existing?
You know, I think it varies from vendor to vendor, and that's where kind of this comes into play. You need to talk with them. I know when we went through our journey, it took a long time to figure out what do we need, what are we staying in governance for nationwide, what we make sure we in compliance, you know, data concerns, personal identifiable information, just simply being able to have a pipeline or dedicated communication path to these load generators. So the best practices, you know, we're actually still developing, and I would really like to hear about from people who are listening what they've went through as they kind of develop their solutions, because I wouldn't be shocked if it's the same thing that we went through.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, and with that, that's that move into the full cloud load testing.
Yes, and this is our very last slide. I'm glad we're getting to this one. So first off, I kind of do owe a little bit of a kudos and appreciation because I don't know if who's read the Storm Runner sheet, but I did kind of steal these images and the circles from that. So if you were the person that put that together, I'm giving you credit now. So those are the images that are there for that. So thank you for those. This is about cloud load testing, the kind of benefits that you get if you go straight full out cloud testing. So in here, I didn't get into the pros and cons and the setups for it, but these are the benefits as you start exploring it. So very scalable. So, you know, for nationwide, the scalability to 1 million virtual users isn't a common thing, but we do have a catastrophic situation. So when hurricanes or tornadoes or something happens to homes, you obviously go out and you try and submit a claim and you want to check your policy. So there are times that we need to quickly scale up and scale down. We don't have to worry about that because within the cloud, they have their own infrastructure that's set up and dedicated for that. The ease of use. So within a lot of these cloud solutions that vendors are offering up, they open it up to anyone and everyone that wants that access to see different pieces of a project and get maybe read-only or viewing rights to certain pieces of performance testing. Again, the geographic testing is a huge benefit. You can emulate from across the United States or even around the world with many of these solutions. The speed is great. You can maintain your tests, quickly create tests, your scripts, upload them, download them, whatever is going on. We've seen great success with that with some of these solutions. And lastly is that continuous integration. So we talk about Jenkins, Hudson, TeamCity. That's a common one within the HP suite, but others are starting integrating as well. And outside of continuous build with APM solutions or other types of things. So Git is becoming very popular with a lot of performance solutions because we want to be able to upload, download scripts easily, be able to audit each other's scripts rather quickly, version control. A lot of these things that is kind of standard on other pieces, but as cloud load testing becomes more popular, we're noticing that the solutions are starting to adjust as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Brandon. Yeah, all very strong best practices, at least or concerns around the cloud load testing area. I think with our time, let's go here. We have a last poll question that kind of wraps up everything of what do you do in regards to performance infrastructure?
So our final poll question today is for your performance infrastructure. If you know, what is the current setup responsible for performance testing? Is it on-premise? Is it in the cloud? Is it a combo of the two? Is it possibly something else? Or you're just not aware, but you just want to make sure your tests run anyways. So give a couple seconds for these to come in so we can get down to the Q&A. And we'll close this poll a little early. Let's close it now so we have a moment for Q&A from attendees. All right, so the results, 88% are on-premise, so that's the big bulk of it. And then tied for 6 and 6 is cloud and a combo of cloud and on-prem. So there's your current trend from the attendees that we have.
So it looks like it's still more that the on-premise, we're going to, I guess, protect our data and know the performance of our own injector environment is still winning out.
And if I can add to that too, like myself, 85-ish% or more of what we test is all on-campus only solutions. So cloud does nothing for me, in that regard, other than, some of the points that Brendan made to, instant upgradability. But unfortunately, that comes with an additional cost that is sometimes very difficult to weigh in on just well, someone else manages it for me, but there's extra cost to it. That can be difficult.
Excellent. All right, and with that, that was our last survey question, and now we're in the, I guess, wrap-up phase for this, and Chris will cover some information here.
Yep. So a couple quick links here for you. As a reminder, the slide deck and the recording will all be available on the Vivit website, specifically under the Performance Engineering SIG after this is all wrapped up. And I believe everybody does get a link to that had registered. We do typically wrap things up with a closing blog that will probably be posted towards the end of the week, or we'll go through some of those results of the surveys and a couple of other closing thoughts as well. The primary link to look at on this, that's always a great one to go to, is the short bit.ly link for the Vivit Performance Engineering SIG, and that's just bit.ly/VivitPE. I do believe it does need to be all uppercase to be able to get to that. Would like to jump in. I appreciate everybody hanging on for a couple extra moments past the top of the hour. And we have a couple of questions, if we can get to those for both you, Brandon and Pitar. So in no particular order, here's a great one. How do you sell performance engineering upwards?
Pitar, you want that one first?
I'll take a crack at it first. Yeah, it's a very good question, and it is actually one of the topics we covered at the 2016 Performance Engineering Summit, and it's a work in progress. And I think my answer for this is actually it has to come from one of the performance ambassadors. And it also goes in line, I'd say, with the maturity of the performance engineering practice within that organization as well, because selling it upward makes no sense if you're really, really early. And it's just very unfortunate, and at least that's how it's worked in my career. But once the group solidifies and shows their worth to a group or enterprise, then that's when you start getting that respect from the upper to the lower group, and then you can start working on that communication, and then say, okay, we are here's our success story, which then equates into ROI, and then I think that's where that conversation opens up. As soon as you can find some way to validly show an ROI of the fact that you're providing performance, which is usually a cost center. And then as those wins build up, then you can start moving into there's other models where you eventually get to the COE model, which is usually driven from a top-down goal structure. So yeah, how do you sell it? I think you have to show lots and lots of wins, and it takes a lot of time. Brandon, I'm interested to see your take on this as well.
No, I think you're exactly right. And actually, if I look at the asker, I see it's Kishore. I see you there, Kishore. I know what you're asking here. So, appreciate the question. So I think Pitar is exactly right. Honestly, the biggest thing is, how many times has an organization been burned without proper performance in place? That's a big one. So when we look at our outages, our ticket queues, some of the incidents that come about, oftentimes leaders that are interested or are not interested are either ones that have been burned enough or the ones that maybe have not experienced it or even aware. Maybe their leadership below them or their teams below them aren't being honest with what's going on because that's not being tracked. Sometimes it's just conversation and exposure. I know for our drive and our motivation to campaign that, it's for us to reach out to our dev lines and, like Pitar said, start investigating and see if we can get some performance ambassadors in play for that and go on from there.
I like the one word that you used in there too, Pitar, and that was respect. And I think really proving yourselves or your team selves to the organization, both upstream and downstream, is something that's constantly overlooked, and it was really good that you brought that up as a point.
Good deal. Do we have any other questions?
We do. Let's jump to one more and let's see how we're doing on time, because I think this is a really good piggyback question to that. And it says, part of a COE, how do you start your practice enabling dev teams to start early adoption of performance testing or performance engineering?
Brandon, I think I want you to jump in on this one first, since you were kind of the implementer of particular practice at Nationwide for Agile.
Right, and so that one, make sure. So Chris, you broke out a little bit there. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, I apologize. As part of a COE, how do you practice enabling dev teams to start early adoption of PT? So think back to the slides where you're talking about getting in earlier and shifting left in your practice of performance testing and performance engineering. And how do you actually do that? Are there techniques or tricks that you can share? Can you just bribe them with cookies or something? What is it that you do to do that?
Is there any other transformational process that happened at the same time to aid in that?
Right. Well, I'll tell you one thing. The cookies have worked quite well. We actually have a PM that always brings Reese's Cups and chocolate. She knows how to bribe us, so that does help. Aside of those things, one of the things that's actually very useful is we talk about handing things back. And the reason why I say hand things back is because throughout, and I've only been in it for so long, but when I look at the history of it, I feel like the load testing, performance testing, and engineering, we've somewhat hoarded specific things because I think that's what made us valuable. We were able to have these solutions, have these tools, and we kind of hoarded them. We said, you know what, this is what we do, this is what we have, but now we need to start evaluating, is this the right time or should we own all of these specific processes? And I'm not saying handing back all load testing and have the teams do their scripting all by themselves. I'm talking small things like when you look at Jenkins, continuous build. You can have Jenkins hook in a PC Performance Center and kick off some build jobs as you deploy or as you start building some of your code. Just get some initial insight from a module level. See how things are going on. We're actually exploring handing back some network virtualization early in the life cycle too. So we look at some of these solutions, allow them to see what the network looks like outside of just locally at your desk. Give you some network virtualization insight and visibility from outside your organization and outside the data center sooner rather than after so many sprints have been conducted. One of the biggest pieces, and we talked about it a few times, is that performance ambassador. So when you start talking about practicing performance sooner, it all starts at oftentimes at solution design. So when you start developing your cards or if you begin building your whole entire project plan, you need to be sooner than later. And as engineers, it's hard for us to dedicate our time to always be that single person to do so. So what that means is we need to start teaching and uplifting other technical domain dev testers and even product managers to understand that this is important and you need to do it sooner in a life cycle rather than later, which is where that proactive versus reactive feeling comes about.
Yep. Excellent answer.
Thank you. I feel you have time for one final question that actually does again piggyback into the last one. So we have an individual that's coming into a 10-year project a little late, and I'm going to interpret their question, and hopefully I'm interpreting it properly. how do you get the team to start noticing performance? I'm presuming they mean that that team on that project hasn't necessarily noticed performance. So they're really late in the game, and they're really trying to drive it. And I think that really tails into what you were just saying, but maybe a thought or advice that you could give them to really help them get in there and prove their worth and show that this is necessary, team.
I can start the answer on this one, and Brandon and you can add in on it. My view on that primarily, especially if you're coming in, say, new on a legacy project, and again, I'm going to go back to, you have to put the seat time in and earn that respect as well. And the way to do that is to get in with that development group, look at the have someone on your PE team or a few people looking at, say, that particular project's infrastructure all the way, are they in production? Obviously, if it's a 10-year-old team, they've already got production, they've already got PT, if the processes and practices are already been established, and then sliding into those basically should be actually relatively easy for performance, as long as you, work with those particular individuals that handle the places where you have technology stack integrations, possibly looking at the last year's worth of outages, have the performance group, maybe start proactively suggesting help in those areas, trying to avoid the fact that you're, calling the baby ugly. Basically you can't just go in and offend everybody by saying, hey, this is all wrong, you could do it better. But basically going in with active, say, technology suggestions and fixes that will be pertinent to that particular group, and then move in from there. It's all about building the relationship at that point for this question, I believe.
Exactly. And I agree with you. And actually, when I look at one of the questions here, as an asker of Tony Lombardo, he had a great point. He said, make it a requirement, definition of done. I think that's exactly right, too, for some of these things. And when, we're calling it campaigning. So as we begin and we're maturing in the Center of Excellence ourselves, we notice that we need to campaign a little bit. We kind of need to sell ourselves, and we need to understand what's your value. So what metrics, what key pieces drive your business, give you good ROI, and ultimately have a good end user experience, which is good for company morale. We all know bad performance is bad for morale and perception of a company, and we know none of us want any of that. So it all depends who you're selling to, right? I can go to a particular leader and maybe sell them performance, but maybe a developing line, maybe if they're not performance-minded, they don't care. It's not part of their agenda. They are meant to, does it pass or does it fail? AKA, is it functional rather than does it perform well? So a lot of it's just understanding who's your audience, who are you selling to, and what do they care about that you're trying to sell them, and to try and provide that vision, say this is where you're at. Maybe with adoption and partnering together, this is where we can take you, and let's see if we can take this journey together, because it's not a destination, as one of my leaders here would say, it's a journey. It's a never-ending journey with maybe brief pit stops along the way to get there.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks both Brandon and Pitar. I think we're at a close for this webinar. Look forward to information coming out from Vivit about where to find the recording and the slides for this webinar. And also look forward to other fun webinars that we're going to have throughout the course of this year. We do a monthly webinar from the Performance Engineering SIG team. And thank you all again for attending, and have a fantastic week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.